Once again, it's Gabe Morales with Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians. I have a guest today who is going to discuss some very interesting topics. Dr. Jeffrey Ian Ross with us today, and we're going to talk a little bit about his work and thoughts on the criminal justice system. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. How you doing today, Gabe?
I'm doing great. So, Jeff, tell us, where were you born and raised?
I was born in Toronto, Canada, and I was raised in Toronto, Canada. I left Toronto to do my master's and my PhD in Colorado in the 1980s.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, what did you do after high school and college? But you kind of already answered that. Why did
Yeah.
you start? I guess, why did you get into your field of study and why did you start your consulting business?
I started out as a political scientist, and that's where my master's degree was in, and so was my PhD. I had also worked almost 4 years, both full time and part time, in a correctional facility. The day I walked out of the correctional facility, I swore that I'd never have anything to do with corrections for the rest of my life, but I was sadly wrong. So I did my master's and my PhD at University of Colorado. And my master's, I looked at terrorism. My PhD, I looked at police use of excessive force. And I got a variety of different jobs, academic jobs in the first few years, nothing very permanent. And what I was slowly realizing was that I was more marketable to departments of criminology and criminal justice with respect to the kinds of things that I did research on, that I was most interested in. And so, shortly after my last criminal justice job during the 90s, mid 90s, I got a 3 year job at the United States Department of Justice with the National Institute of Justice. For those of your listeners who don't know, the National Institute of Justice is the research wing for the Department of Justice, and they sponsor research that helps state and local criminal justice agencies. Juvenile justice agencies, not so much. That's a different branch of the Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs. But law enforcement, correctional facilities, probation and parole, we sponsor research there. And most of the cutting edge research that has been done since the 1960s or so, large scale cutting edge research, it's been funded in one way or another through the National Institute of Justice. So it was interesting to do that. And then after that, I got a job in what I would say a traditional department of criminal justice for a University of Baltimore. And I've been teaching corrections for the most part ever since. So since the late 1990s, I've been teaching classes in the field of corrections, whether we're talking about introduction to corrections, whether we're talking about special topics in corrections, whether we're talking about probation and parole, community supervision. And then that covers all sorts of things, including things like classification, institutional corrections, violence, sentencing, death penalty, et cetera, et cetera. And so through that experience, through that job, I've done a considerable amount of publishing and visiting correctional facilities and interacting with all manner of people who are connected to corrections.
Sounds very interesting. Understand you've written over 2 dozen books, and the one that I saw most recently was Introduction to Convict Criminology. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this book, Introduction to Convict Criminology, was published last year. And what it does is it integrates a considerable amount of research that both myself and colleagues have done over the past close to 2 decades in this unique field, convict criminology. So, in the early 1990s, a colleague, Stephen Richards, and I came up with this idea of convict criminology. And basically, what it advocates is trying to bring in the voices of educated individuals who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, more specifically, people who have graduated with a not just a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, but they're on their way to getting a PhD or they have a PhD. And in the field of criminology, there are quite a few people who fit that kind of description, and they're now working as criminologists. Some are working for criminal justice agencies. And we argued that their voices are underrepresented for a whole bunch of reasons. And we have a lot of allies, people who are justice impacted. They may not have served time, but maybe they were arrested, maybe they were charged, maybe they were convicted of a crime, wrongfully or not, or they have a loved one who was arrested, charged, convicted. Maybe they did time, so they visited them while their loved one was in prison, a son, a father, or a wife. So they have been affected by the criminal justice system, and many of them are very well educated, and so they could speak with a degree of, I wouldn't say necessarily say confidence, but they had one foot in academia, but they also had experience with people who are behind bars. So this is not to diminish criminal justice practitioner experience and knowledge, but it was a different voice, different perceptions that we were trying to integrate into the field of criminology and criminal justice, the academic field of criminology and criminal justice that we felt was ignored or had been ignored. And so a considerable amount of scholarship has been produced since the 90s. About 3 books were published, 2 edited books, one sole authored book. And then this is the first sole authored book that tries to do a comprehensive job for the field. There's also a division of the American Society of Criminology called the Division of Convict Criminology. So the area has grown in terms of people who know about it, who publish on this topic, who are interested in helping expand this field, and also help people who are formerly incarcerated. So jumping ahead, the convict criminology approach has 3 basic platforms. One is to conduct research, scholarly research. Another is mentorship, mentoring people who are behind bars, individuals who have been released from prison who want to do bachelor's, master's, or perhaps even a doctorate, helping them navigate the complex system of academia, of university education, college education. And then we serve a kind of activist role by trying to advocate for changes in sentencing, changes in prison policies and practices and laws, that sort of thing. So that's the kind of thing that convict criminology has been involved with for close to 2 decades.
Sounds very interesting. The word convict for a lot of people has a very negative connotation. I've heard a lot of these formerly incarcerated, is what they call themselves a lot of times, which a lot of people would consider just a more politically correct term for a convict. But words, I think you agree, do have meanings. Sometimes, stereotypes bring out biases in individuals. I guess I'm wondering, do these formerly incarcerated individuals that have done some academic research, and it sounds like speaking engagements, and some have written books, it sounds like, is there like an association, or do they do this on an independent basis? How is this related to the general public?
You raise a few interconnected, I think there's a handful of questions that are interconnected that you are, alluding to. The first question, I think, is the notion of, is the word convict, or can it be perceived as a negative term? And there's no question about it. And yes, words do have meaning, labels do have meaning. There are some individuals who are affiliated with the convict criminology network who find that the word is inappropriate. They would prefer to be referred to as formerly incarcerated. I understand that. I get that. It sort of softens the term a little, but in the eyes of the general public, whether you're a convict or formerly incarcerated, this is basically the same thing. You're still discriminated against. So if we just change the name, it doesn't really change, society's reaction to you. And there's other nuances too. And I've written about this not only in the book Introduction to Convict Criminology, but people who want to get a sort of sense of some of these arguments can also look at some of the blogs that I've written and available on my website. And so, there's terms like returning citizens, which is a bit of a misnomer too. So we do recognize, or one should be sensitive to the fact that by using the word convict, people who are formerly incarcerated, who are reclaiming that space in the sense that they're saying, listen, I don't want other people who are non-convicts telling me what I should be called. If I want to call myself formerly incarcerated or convict, that's my decision. That's my point. And there are numerous people who are formerly incarcerated who prefer using the word convict. That's part of my identity. That's what they may argue. Another point you made was, please remind me, what am I missing? What did I forget?
What kind of forums or platforms do these individuals then get
Yeah.
their messages out?
Yeah, there are an emerging number of complementary forums for formerly incarcerated individuals. I know that in the state of California, there's a very strong network of individuals who are going to college in the Cal State system, and they are holding conferences, they're delivering papers. It's a kind of a mutual self-help program. There's a couple more programs too that exist in the United States, but the convict criminology approach network was mainly geared to people who were at a university trying to complete a doctoral degree, get an academic job, and do scholarly research. Now, we've also realized that when we go to different countries, such as South American countries, that the importance of a PhD in terms of the debate amongst scholars when it comes to prisons is not as important. And so that kind of element is not as important, maybe in a South American context. These are just some sort of, I would say, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a contradiction, but it's a challenge to kind of figure out how that kind of works with the original kinds of, I wouldn't say founding documents, but the original intent of convict criminology. One of the original intent of convict criminology was to do ethnographic research, which is research where you or autoethnographies where you are recounting stories, experiences that you had when you were behind bars or upon release, and you do this in a very systematic fashion. But we've learned over the years that by only focusing on one type of scholarship, that you are limiting yourself in your ability to better understand the carceral experience, prison conditions, the experiences, the relationships among convicts, relationships with their family, relationships with correctional officers, correctional staff, correctional workers, correctional leaders. So I think it's important to have a general framework, a loose framework, and see how concepts, people, situations jive with the original sentiment of convict criminology, which was essentially the voices of formerly incarcerated individuals or incarcerated individuals, and making sure that they're not ignored, because as you know, is that we can kind of get into a situation where we have kind of tunnel vision. If it's only the academics who are speaking and making recommendations about how to reform, jails, prisons, halfway houses, other kinds of detention facilities, and they don't have any lived experience, then you're going to get kind of skewed findings and skewed recommendations. If it's only correctional officers or correctional workers making recommendations, then those recommendations will be skewed sort of in favor of correctional workers, correctional officers. So the convict criminology perspective does not say ignore all other perspectives, but let's integrate the voices of the people who are most directly affected. And that raises lots of other questions, which we can talk about as we progress through this conversation.